don't you think if God had said, do not have own slaves, I mean, some people would have still disobeyed God, but it will still reduce slavery a little bit. I think he should have just said no slaves.
Let's say he said no slaves. What do you do about the prisoners?
The prisoners can continue to be prisoners and be forced to work also.
Okay, so the prisoners can be slaves. Okay.
Yes.
People that you conquer in battle. So what do you have left? You have the women and children left. What do you do with them?
You don't enslave them.
I'm not asking what you don't do with them. I'm asking you, what do you do with them?
Nothing.
So you send them out in the wilderness and die? So your solution is you rather kill them all than put them into indentured servitude.
Are they free to go to other nations to try and find, like they can offer their services freely to Egypt?
Guess what's going to happen to them if they go to Egypt?
They will be taken as slaves, you say? Okay.
All right, what's up, bro?
So I was just watching your video on slavery, the one you made 2 months ago.
How'd you watch that? Oh, YouTube, yeah.
Yeah, YouTube, yeah. And I just had a few comments I would like to share.
Sure.
If it's okay.
Yeah.
So one thing you said is that nowadays we condone slavery because we kind of condone slavery because prisoners in jail are forced to work, right? But
it's not even forced to work. It's the fact that they're not free. They can't make their own choices in life.
Okay. So, but to me, this is kind of like saying that we condone stealing because we make people pay fines when they break something, but obviously it's not the same.
How does that logically follow?
Because it's a punishment from the government. If you break something, the punishment is you have to pay a fine. The government taking your money is not the same as stealing. In the same way, you break the law and the punishment we agree on is similar to slavery. But
Can you define stealing?
Stealing is taking the property you don't own, taking property of someone else by like.
Okay, so if I come to your house and I say, I wish to take your car, and you say yes, and I don't own your car and I take it, is it stealing?
If you ask me for the car. And I say yes, no, that's not stealing. But if you threaten me or you threaten me,
it's not stealing. It's not stealing if you give it to me. So then, what is your definition of stealing? Because it's not just taking something I don't own. So it's taking something I don't own with a caveat to it. What's the caveat?
It's either by force or like if I take it without your knowledge, you know what I mean?
By knowledge or force. Okay. So if we make someone pay a fine, right?
Yeah.
You don't force them. You don't put a gun to their head and say they have to pay a fine.
Well, but if they don't pay it, people with guns are going to come to your hand.
Yeah, there's consequences to not paying the fine. But the consequences is for breaking the law. And breaking the law is like that fine. So you're not stealing their money. It's not theft.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, I agree. It's not stealing your money. But being put in prison, being put in jail is slavery. But it's a consequence of your actions. There's this idea that you seem to be imposing is that slavery is only for those that have not committed any crimes or are perfectly innocent. That's not the case.
Well, I think slavery, as the term, as people refer to it, it refers to doing slavery to innocent people. The term, as everyone understands,
nobody's ever used that term for innocent people, because there's indentured servitude that's been throughout history, and these would be slaves, and they weren't innocent people. There's also prisoners of war that would have been slaves throughout history. Those wouldn't have been innocent people, and they were made slaves.
Okay, well, I think when people refer to slavery, they mean to more like civilians. You also mentioned this point in your video. You talk about prisoners of war, but I think there is a distinction that nowadays prisoner of war is more likely to be a combatant, but back then it could have easily been a civilian, and nowadays we avoid involving civilians on this, at least theoretically. But back then, Israelis will go to a city and they will invade and they will take civilians as slaves. And this could be considered a prisoner of war, but it's not like today when it's a combatant. Back then, it could have been a civilian. So it's not the same.
Still, either way, it's still slavery. You're just arguing about the method on how you become a slave. I agree it's different types of slavery. You could be an innocent person or a guilty person, but you're still a slave. If you go to the American Constitution, it literally says you cannot own a person unless they've committed a crime.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, I think the way people understand the word is just obvious. It doesn't refer to prisoners that are in jail. It just like if
Why
you
not?
get very technical because
What's the difference between a prisoner in jail and then a slave from 2,000 years ago who committed a crime and was forced to work for somebody?
you said a slave who committed a crime. I'm talking about people who did not back then who did
Okay,
not commit a
so
crime.
what is going on? Anyways, so your argument is that if you are guilty and I take you and I make so for example, you come to my house and you steal something from me, and then I grab you and I make you work for me, right? For however amount of time, I own you as my property. You're no longer a slave.
If this is the law before I stole it, and the government uh, made this into law, if you steal something from somebody, you have to
Yeah, you're
pay.
not answering my question. If you come and steal something from my house, and then I grab you, kidnap you, and make you my indentured worker in my house, are you or are you not a slave?
If you do it, yes, but not if the government does it.
Okay, so if the government steals you and makes you work, then you're not a slave.
If the government steals me in response to me breaking the law, then no, I'm not a slave.
Okay, so
If they does,
that's arbitrary and ad hoc because if you commit a crime and I steal you, then you are a slave. But if you commit a crime and the government steals you, then you're not a slave. What is the symmetry breaker?
the symmetry breaker is that the law has to be written before I committed the action, and I knew about the law before I did it. So I know that the government
You're
has
not, you're
this
not,
law
you're not
written.
answering. You're not answering the question, right? If I steal you, right? It's still in the law. It says you cannot commit a crime. If I steal you and make you work for me, you are a slave. But if the government steals you and makes you work for them, you're not a slave. What's the difference?
The difference is the government made this law before. For example, the government will only make me work a proportional amount of time in proportion to what I
Yeah, and slaves
done as
usually
a
had a
crime.
proportionate amount of time.
Well, the difference is that the government has a legitimate authority to do this, and
Okay, who
uh,
gave them that
I am
authority?
aware of this. We all did as society.
Okay, so because
It,
society gives them a specific authority, all of a sudden they have this special ability to do things that are different and not have the same meaning.
well, in the way that we normally refer to as slavery, then yes.
Okay, so let me, I buy a private island. I own the laws to that island. It's my own sovereign country. You come to that island. I have made a law based off the authority of the fact that in my country that I could just own you because I don't know, I don't like the way your eyebrows sit. I'm not actually insulting your eyebrows. I'm just using an example. So I don't like the way the eyebrows sit on your face. Now, are you a slave if I make you a slave on my private island?
I don't know the specifics of international law to tell you if you buy an island and if you are like the government of that island, what happens when I enter the island? I don't know the specific of it. I don't. Obviously, we have international laws for cases like this. I cannot tell you exactly what
Yeah,
happens.
we don't have laws that circumvent all of society all around the world. We don't have a world
Okay.
moral government.
Yeah.
So again, if I have my own country, my own government, and I now have that authority, and you come to my country and I just say to you, I don't like the way your eyebrows look, so now you're my slave. Are you or are you not my slave?
If I entered the country with the full
Mm-hmm.
knowledge of this law being like this, and I knew that you could just say that, then in a way I was aware of
Mm-hmm.
this, and it will be a punishment. It will be not the same as exactly the same as slave.
Okay. So the only difference is your preconceived knowledge from before. So if that's the case, then there are no slaves in the Bible.
Okay, but how is that?
Because according to the Bible, you are not allowed to steal a man and sell him into slavery. The only way you can go into slavery was being a prisoner of war, being born into
Okay,
it, or
okay,
selling yourself into slavery.
okay. And by the way, this law, it applies only to Israelites. You also say that in the
No,
video,
that's not
but
true.
it's, I think,
It doesn't only apply to
okay,
Israelites because that's an ancient Near East law. That's also in the Code of Babylon, right? It was against the law in the ancient Near East under the Egyptian rule, under the Canaanites, for anybody in any nation to steal people and sell them
Okay,
into slavery.
no, what I meant is that the law in the Bible, in the Mosaic text, the
Okay,
specific law
so,
in the
again, it doesn't matter because it was against the law across all the nations. This was a common practice in the ancient Near East.
to take people from their own nation as slaves, not
You
to
could
take
not, you are
foreigners.
not allowed to kidnap and steal people and sell them into slavery.
You can if they are people from other nations, I think.
Only in acts of war.
Yeah, but acts of war is like they are in the land that I want
Okay,
to have.
so if that's the case, then you have a difficulty time explaining that how in Scripture there is a slave that ran away from a different nation and came to Israel, and they were not to be accepted as a slave; they were to be held and kept as an equal to an Israelite.
Yes, I think in that specific instance, yeah, the law is relatively human because they say that you are supposed to help get away slaves from other nations.
Right.
So,
but either way, even if I grant you your argument, it's completely irrelevant because according to your standard, all they have to do is be aware that it's part of their governing law and then it's not slavery. So even if the Mosaic law said that we are allowed to steal people from other nations, that's not a problem because they're the governing body and they're the government and they're doing it. That was your standard that you said so before.
yes, but they are doing a law that is wrong. There is
But again, it's not slavery because you said earlier that if you knew, like if you entered in my country of Jonistan and my law said that you had funky eyebrows, so therefore you're my slave, you would not be a slave because you entered my country knowing my law. So if you're in there in the ancient Near East and you're aware that people can come from other countries and steal you and make you a slave, you're not a slave because you're aware of it. This was your argument.
The difference is that I decided to enter your country with that knowledge and with and if you know, then
okay, if you're born in my country and I have that law and I make you a slave, are you a slave?
Yes, I think yes, because and it will be a very unfair law.
Okay, so then we have to go back. Then it's not the fact that it's a governing body that makes you a slave or doesn't make you a slave. It's some sort of knowledge. So you still haven't given me the definition or the separating factor on the difference between the government stealing you and making you a slave versus me stealing you and making you a slave.
I think the difference is that the government is doing it as a punishment for a crime.
I could do it as a punishment for a crime.
Yeah, sure, but it has to be written in the law beforehand, and
I can write it in my law.
Yeah. Okay.
So again, if it's written in the law beforehand, the ancient Israelites, and I don't agree with this, I'm just giving you this for the sake of argument, wrote it into their law beforehand, so they're not slaves.
Yeah, but it's not like they enter it. They were born there, they have no choice. But in the case of the Iceland, I mean, yeah, if I had to enter your country, like for a medical emergency, and then you do this.
What you're doing is called special pleading. You're continually moving the goalposts and changing your definition every time I show you have an inconsistent worldview.
I think it's just clearly very different.
I just want you to give me the definition of slavery.
Slavery is forcing, what we understand as slavery is forcing an innocent person to work against their will.
Okay, so if they're not innocent, they cannot be slaves.
Yeah, okay, if they are, you cannot say it's a small crime, therefore they are like not innocent. You cannot say that taking anything from you, then they're not innocent, so they can be taken as slaves.
Right. So you're still not answering my question. If somebody is not innocent, they cannot become a slave, no matter what happens to them. Correct?
No, that's not the case.
Okay, so then what is your definition of slavery?
Well, if you get so technical like that, I will have to think of it, how to define slavery so that it specifically applies to this situation. But I think it's clear to everybody that the
it doesn't matter if it's clear to everybody. That's called an appeal to populum, right? That's a fallacious argument. Just because it's clear to the popular to the group of people doesn't mean it's true. If you want to make that argument, you're going to have a big burden to carry because for the vast majority of history, up until the 1800s, slavery was part of the norm and part of the culture.
Yes, but we recognize that ancient people have a backwards morality and we have advanced it.
According to what standard? According to what standard do ancient people have a backwards morality?
To the normal standard that we have on the West today.
Okay, so how do you know that your standard of morality is the standard that we must all hold to?
Well, it's the standard that seems to me like the best of it. That's the one we agreed to.
Okay, so
It's-
but they agreed to a different standard 500 years ago. So why is their standard worse?
well, they didn't. The innocent people did not agree to this. I think it's more like the rulers uh, imposed it
Can you
on the
show me?
people
Can you
back.
show me a single writing in antiquity that combats slavery? Because
co-
the earliest writing that I can find in antiquity that combats slavery is in the 1850s by the Pope.
Yeah,
Right. So
yeah,
can
but
you? So if you're saying it's only by the rulers in power, then you should be able to find a whole bunch of people in the past in history who weren't in rulers, who weren't in power, saying this is a horrible thing that you're doing to us.
people back then is the same as sexism and racism. They didn't recognize it as evil on the same way that we do it. You
Right.
know,
So they didn't recognize it as evil. So again, how do you
yes,
know your standard is better than the standard they all collectively agreed to 500 years ago?
they did not agree to. They did not have democracy. They did not collectively agree to in the way that we collectively agree to it.
Right. So nobody contended with it. It's part of the culture. They all agree to it. There's no problem. 1/3 of the population is slaves. It's just as common as somebody working at McDonald's. So
Uh,
again, how do you know that your standard is better?
well, it seems better because it leads to better human happiness than the ancient standards. That's what
Okay.
we
Okay. Prove
do.
that. Prove that claim.
Well, the index of moral development and happiness is higher today in the modern world than in the ancient world.
How do you know that?
Probably it has been measured.
How did they measure the happiness 1,000 years ago?
Well, it's things about the well-being, such as life expectancy, how people, how health.
Life expectancy is not directly correlated to happiness. Now, it certainly has a factor to it, right? If you have a higher life expectancy, you're probably going to be happier, knowing you're going to live longer. But that's just an assumption. It's an argument from silence. How do you know people were happier 1,000 years ago?
I think it's not controversial to say that the well-being of the people in general today is higher than 2,000 years ago. I mean,
Right.
if
We're
you
not
can,
talking about well-being. We're talking about happiness.
I think it's very similar. Well-being and happiness in this context is
I
very
know
closely.
I know lots of people that have really good states of lives. They're healthy. They have good families. They have good finances, and they're not happy.
Yeah, I think they will probably be even worse if they lived 2,000 years ago, or
You're
if they
just
have.
you're just making assumptions. How do you know?
But I think this assumption is reasonable because of how things were back then.
I don't think it's reasonable. I don't
I
think
mean,
we just get to make assumptions and say that's the case. Like if you're going to combat my worldview and you're going to say it's wrong with assumptions, then I'm going to deny you.
but you should be disputing that the well-being and the happiness of people today in general is higher than 2000
Why can't I dispute that?
because it doesn't seem rational. It just seems absurd to say that.
According to what? How is it absurd? How do you know? You're just saying it is. You got to give me a standard to base that off of. Is it not logically possible that 1,000 years ago people were happier, right? Because they were with their families, they lived in their tiny communities, they knew everybody, they weren't staring at the screens all the time, they were going outside, they were getting more sunlight, but they had a lower life expectancy. Is that not reasonable to say?
We stare at screens because that makes us happy. It provides entertainment. This is something that makes us happy, not unhappy.
Right. So there's definitely short term happiness versus long term happiness, right? You can find something in short term happiness. Like I can do some drugs right now and it's going to give me short term happiness, but it's not going to give me long term, more fulfilling happiness in my life.
Yeah, but I think, but today we probably have.
But you didn't answer my question. You're
Okay,
dodging it
what was
now.
your question?
Is it not reasonable to say that it's possible that people were more happy based off the circumstances of being more involved in the community, more involved in their families, less screen time, more outside with the sun, standing on grass, touching grass? Is it not a reasonable to say thing? It's possible that they were happier, but just not had a longer life expectancy.
It's logically possible, yes, but I don't find it reasonable.
Okay,
I don't
based off
find it that
what?
reasonable. Based on how one can imagine the living conditions were. People don't have toilets. People don't have
I've crapped in
running
an outhouse.
waters.
It's not that bad. Crapping in an outhouse is not that bad.
Okay, we did not have electricity, water, heating. You don't have.
Then why do people go camping? If you need heating, water, electricity, indoor plumbing for happiness, why do people choose to go camping?
They do it for 1 or 2 days. They don't choose to live like that for years. Because it will
You're
be
not answering the
ridiculous.
question. Does camping provide them happiness?
Yes.
Do they have running water?
No.
Do they have indoor plumbing?
No.
Okay, so then you just stating having these things leads to happier lifestyles is based off what?
I mean, having them in constantly, not missing them on one day because of
You're just
also you
making
like
assumptions. You're making assumptions. I want to see some actual data, some actual evidence, a solid argument with some good premises and a conclusion. So far, this whole conversation has just been assumptions. You've assumed that the government just gets to decide whether or not it's slavery. You've assumed morality is just better now. You've assumed people are just happier now, and you have nothing to base that off of.
I think it's reasonable to say that people have higher well-being now that than compared to 5,000 years ago. I think it's very reasonable thing to say. If you're
People
gonna,
have better health.
I think well-being and happiness as well,
Well, how do
probably
you know they have better well-being? They have better health.
better health. Yes,
So we have a better
well,
medical system. We have
because
data for that.
I cannot have a poll from 5,000 years ago
Okay, well then don't
showing you
say
how
they
happy.
didn't. If you don't know, don't say they didn't.
But it's reasonable that this is the
Reasonable. Okay, how do you know it's reasonable?
case. Do you think this is unreasonable?
I say I'm claiming agnostic. You're making a positive claim and saying you have no evidence for it.
Well, but since you just, I don't know, it seems reasonable to me that people are happier and this well-being that is higher today will also lead to happiness being higher today.
Okay, but you saying the well-being is better. How do you know that?
Because well-being is correlated with things like material wealth, with health, with running water. But I mean, running water like always,
Okay,
not
can
like,
you show me the data on that?
I will have to look it up and dig it, but right now I guess it will be hard, but I think it's a reasonable thing to say.
So you're saying right now, if I travel over to an unknown country across seas where there's a tribe that they don't have electricity, running water, and things like that, that I'm going to walk around their community, I should expect to see more depressed people than I should see walking around my community here in Canada.
Yes, I think so.
Okay. I'd love to see some evidence on that because every time I see videos of these people across seas, they always seem to be running around with huge smiles on their face.
Because they showed you specifically those parts.
Okay, but you're just making assumptions again.
Okay. Okay, I find this will be a reasonable assumption, but okay, I mean, sure, maybe I just can't prove it, Oh, can I mention another point you made on your video?
Mm-hmm.
You said that if God back then would have told people not to have slaves, you say that people would not have listened. And you also
Correct.
say that if today, you made this example, you say that if today God told us not to have abortions, you say that people will not listen, will not obey this. Yeah?
Yes.
I personally think, I just don't think this is true. I think people would obey if God himself, came to the earth.
Okay, what is your evidence for that? Because every piece of evidence that I have, so for example, I have the historical writings of the Bible, says every command that God gave to people disobeyed.
Like what, for example?
So don't make idols. The first thing they did on Mount Sinai is they made a cow and worshipped it after they're commanded to not make idols and worship them. So that'd be an example.
Okay.
Don't steal. They stole from other nations. God punished them for that. The Bible is riddled with just people. Only thing they're doing is disobeying God constantly, even though they interacted and spoke with God.
Okay. Yes, I don't think this came from God directly. This came from Moses, who told them what God had just said.
Moses disobeyed God.
Okay. Yeah, I will grant you that point. I will have to grant you that point, but I think it's unrealistic. I think today it's not true it's not how people will behave. I think some people maybe will disobey God, but I think the vast majority of people will indeed obey if God just came and told us not to do this or that.
Okay, based off what?
Based on how people are. I mean, generally,
so from my experience on how people are, is that they don't like being told what to do and they like to make their own decisions.
Okay. Yeah, but I think if God himself comes and tells you not to do this or that, you will have to be kind of dumb not to obey him,
Do people not obey their prime ministers and presidents all the time?
Oh, because they think they can get away with it, but that's not the case with God.
Well, do they usually get away with it with prime ministers and presidents? Most people don't. So why do people do it? If you're statistically lower to actually getting away with it, why do you do it?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Okay, honestly, I cannot quite explain you why people risk crimes, because sometimes for me, I ask the same question. Why do people commit crimes? They think they can get away with it when statistically they can't. I don't know why they do it really, but I think they just think in the moment they're thinking, oh, I can't get away with, I won't get caught. I will get away with it. I think that's what they're thinking mostly,
Okay, so then why should you expect to see differently with God?
because you cannot get away with it in the case of God. God will is
But why
omniscient
would
and
they
will
why would
know.
they not think that they could? People think that all the time.
But God sees everything, so He will see that you were doing something wrong. It's not the same, you know what I mean? A government
That
has to
doesn't mean
catch
that
you.
that
Like,
just because they will get caught doesn't mean people won't think that they won't, or that they're going to loophole God, or they're going to find some sort of circumstance where they can get past it, or they're going to be able to do something where they won't have to suffer the consequences, or they just don't even care about the consequences in the first place, or they think they're more morally superior than God.
okay, I think only a few rare exceptions could do this, but the vast majority of people will not do
Okay,
this.
but
I don't
again,
think that.
you're just broadly gesturing and saying this is the case. I don't believe you.
Mhm. Yeah, well, because that's how it seems for me, you know?
Yeah, but
That's how I
what seems
imagine it.
no offense to you, but what it seems to you doesn't matter to me.
But don't you find it reasonable that if God came today and told us some rules, don't you think most people will obey Him?
So here's the thing. There's a lot of Christians in the chat who believe in God, and I'm talking to you guys right now, and you can look at the chat and see what they have to say. So Christians in the chat, do you believe God exists? And do you think God knows everything you do? And then finally, have you ever disobeyed him knowing that God knows everything that you do?
If I may say, I think they believe that God is going to forgive them, you know, because I don't, I,
So I know you can't see TikTok. I'm getting a lot of yeses in TikTok. Well, actually, you can see it on my screen.
yeah. Okay, I think well, I was raised Catholic back then, and the idea is you can confess your sins and you will be forgiven. You know, so I think people who believe that they will be forgiven by God and they think, oh, this is not a big deal, you know. But if God directly comes like to you and tells you directly, oh, this thing is wrong, then it's just different to disobey him,
Okay, so there's
like
lots
super
of
direct.
so all the evidence that we have, right? People know God exists. They believe in God. They follow God. They disobey Him. All that written data about people who've interacted with God on a personal level and seen Him personally have
Okay.
disobeyed Him.
You mean the Israelites back then?
So like
They,
Moses disobeyed
okay, okay.
Moses disobeyed him, Noah disobeyed him, all
Yes.
the prophets disobeyed him, David disobeyed him. Like there's not a single person who didn't disobey him at some point except for Jesus. Jesus is the only one who didn't. Even the apostles walking with Jesus disobeyed Jesus.
Okay.
So I have everybody saying they've all disobeyed God at some point, and you're saying they wouldn't. Why?
Because they didn't, okay, they didn't got it directly from God, but
Doesn't
and
matter.
they think God
They
will
know
forgive.
that's completely irrelevant. They know God is watching. They know they
Okay.
can't get away with it. They believe God
They think
exists.
God will
What?
forgive them. They think God will forgive this, you know. They think if I do
Right.
this, God will forgive
Cool.
this.
So if God shows himself to the whole world, that doesn't change. God
And
will
we also
God's still
say,
forgiving.
we can also
Okay.
say that they believed that back then as well. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I hear you.
Oh, hey, what's up, man?
Hi, what's up?
Well, we can also say that back then they believed God would forgive them as well, right?
Well,
So you have these,
yeah,
like with the Israelites, you have this expectation at Sinai where literally the presence of God comes and rests on the mountain and appears in a cloud before the people, and a voice that shouts out to all of the Israelites. Literally, this is the clearest expression in the entire Bible to a group of people, where God speaks down from the mountain. And the people are so scared of God that they beg Moses to intercede and speak for God rather than hear God's voice himself. Because he was coming down off the mountain, they had to consecrate themselves, they had to sanctify themselves, all of these things. They literally heard the audible voice of God were terrified. They received the commandments through proxy through Moses, and then they still disobeyed the commandments. And so it doesn't seem to be the case within biblical lives. It doesn't seem to be the case within individual Christians' lives, regardless of time period, that an experience with God is necessarily going to entail some sort of absolute obedience. Rather, it's human nature to disobey, even though you know what is right. And that's one of the scriptures in the Bible. It says, he who knows to do right and does not do it, to him it is sin. And so the recognition that, okay, there is this thing that we should do, there's these things that we should not do, but you know what? There's these things that we should not do. And what does Paul say? These are the same things I find myself doing. That's one of the scriptures. It's like the tongue twister of the Bible. The things I know to do, I do not do. The things I do not want to do, these are the things I find myself doing. And so he says, listen, even though I had an experience with God on the Damascus Road, even though Jesus showed up, he appeared to me, he called me to the ministry, I was blind, he healed me through Ananias, all of these things, he even says, the things I do not want to do, I still find myself doing. And so an experience with God, it's only temporary within this life. But when we die, when we go to heaven, we're going to be in his presence eternally in a way that we are separate now.
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. I will have to grant you this point based on what you say about the prophets. I think Christians today is not the same because it's not directly from God, and they think God will forgive them. But what you say about the prophets, about the people back then, is true. They still disobeyed. But let me ask you this: don't you think if God had said, "Do not have own slaves," I mean, some people would have still disobeyed God, but it will still reduce slavery a little bit. Like not everyone will disobey God. Like even if some people will disobey him, maybe this will still help reduce slavery even a little bit, and it will be like better.
Yeah, but so there's a problem with that. I agree with you. It reduces a little bit. But then what about the people who don't listen? And because of the culture they live in, the culture that isn't against slavery, the culture that's part of the normative, they continue to operate in slavery. So are you saying that God should have set a set of rules where he says no slaves, but if you do own slaves, this is a method on which you should do it?
I think he should have just said no slaves.
Okay, so he says no slaves, and then people still get slaves. And then there's no rules or regulation on how to operate with them or how to treat them.
Yeah, okay.
Because you have to remember this culture,
Yeah, okay.
in the ancient Near East, slavery is not a contention. Nobody in the ancient Near East, not this long ago, bro, nobody was against slavery. I'm sure some slaves who were in slavery was like, oh, this sucks. But like the only thing I can find in history of people being against slavery was Spartacus.
Okay.
And he was a slave who rebelled against Rome. But outside of that, man, it's just part of the culture.
Okay, I see your point. So you think it's necessary then for God to allow this so that he can have some regulations on how to treat slaves humanly? Is that like your point?
No, what I'm saying is God is trying to rule with us, not over us. He's trying to sanctify us. He's trying to move us in the direction where we become people, which is what happened, where we become people who do not want slaves. And that's exactly the purpose of setting Israel aside. That's exactly the purpose of Christ, is to eventually get us to the point where we're sanctified and we're actually the creation God intended us. The standard of what we're supposed to be is in Genesis 1. There's no slaves in Genesis 1. This is part of a fallen, sinful world that eventually happens. Then God comes down, meets us on our level, and guides us into that. This is why the law, right, is fulfilled with Christ on the cross, because the law is no longer relevant. It's not a moral standard for all time. It was a moral standard. It wasn't even a moral standard. It was virtue ethics that were given to those people at that time to guide them to Christ, for the law of the prophets is for Christ. Christ comes, he fulfills the law. It's brought to an end, and then we start becoming these people that don't want that. And we can actually see this in history. It's through Judeo-Christian ethics that we started abolishing slavery. Like I said, the very first writing of abolishing slavery that I could find, I could be wrong about this, but that from my study, from my research, was from the Pope, who said that we should not go into First Nations communities, right, and take them as slaves when we started coming over from Europe into Canada and the United States. After that, what do we see? We see the Atlantic slave trade. Who are the people that started the Underground Railroad? It was Christians. right? These are the people who say these are people made in the image of God and should be set free. So this is the purpose of God, is not to just give us commands, do exactly as I say. It's to make us people who do not need commands.
Okay, and you cannot do this if you like forbid slavery. I mean, you have to allow this slavery in order to be able to turn us into this kind of people.
So let's really bring this to its logical conclusion. God forbids slavery in the Old Testament. Okay, well, what would be the next commandment that you say he should bring?
I'm not sure what you meant by that.
Well,
I'm not
okay.
sure I understood the question.
God forbids slavery.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Then that say he makes that the 11th commandment.
Yeah. Okay.
What do you think the 12th commandment should be?
I cannot give you on top of my head like what is the perfect moral code? What would the perfect moral code look like for that time? I don't have it on top of my head.
Okay, so 1,000 years ago, they wouldn't even brought up slavery as the 11th commandment. So 1,000 years from now, we're going to be asking a question: why didn't God have the 12th commandment? You shall not commit abortion.
Okay.
1,000 years from then, they're going to say, hey, why didn't God have the 13th commandment, saying that John shouldn't grow out his facial hair because it looks funny? Just vaguely referencing things.
Mhm.
The point is, as we progress, we look back upon things and say, why didn't God do? And that's actually a good thing, because that means we are being sanctified. We are growing into Christ. The problem is we keep looking at it from after the process. It's like looking at ourselves as children and saying, well, why did you let me poop my pants? It's because you were a child.
But couldn't this be used as an excuse to allow like even other things? Like, for example, if God had allowed stealing or murder, something that is clearly wrong, you could still justify with the same argument. You could say that God is sanctifying us and that allowing that was part of our sanctification.
And if they lived in a culture that was just like murder's fine, everybody should be part of murder, then yeah, I would agree with you. But they didn't live in a culture.
Yeah,
They lived
okay.
in a culture that understand murdering and killing people was already wrong. So something that they knew. So God incentivizes this and pushes this forward as the commandments that they should live by.
Yeah, okay. I see your point. Yeah, you have a point there, of course. What would have happened if God had told them not to have slaves, and it was just part of their culture? But don't you think if God had made a prohibition against slavery, then they would have changed the culture? So, and they would have, if God had told them this from the beginning, they would have changed the culture and adapted to this.
I don't know what would have happened. I can only speculate, but I can say that the law was not given to be a moral standard. We know that because of what Jesus says about divorce. He says, we gave you the law of divorce because of the hardness of your hearts.
Yes,
So,
to say that. Yeah.
Yeah. So
you said that
yeah. So there's things in the law that are not meant to be a moral standard to live off of, and it's not okay in God's eyes.
Okay.
So I don't know what would have changed or would have been different, but there had to be a reason that God allowed it.
Okay, but there seems to be a cultural, moral, relativist thing to it, like to say that if the culture back then didn't see it as evil, to say that then it's okay for God to allow them to do this. I'm not sure I can agree with that, but
I didn't say it's okay or good. So condoning means allowing something that you know is evil.
Yeah.
It's not saying it's a good thing.
Yeah, but what's not okay is to condone this, because
okay, let's if you really want to push it, let's say he said no slaves. What do you do about the prisoners?
The prisoners, except he says the prisoners can continue to be prisoners and be forced to work also.
Okay, so the prisoners can be slaves.
The combatant prisoners, I think, can be slaves. I think it's fair. Combatant, not civilians.
Okay, so somebody's a thief in your community.
Okay, yeah.
What do you do with them?
Yeah, you mean those? Yeah, I think the prisoners can be slaves. I think this is fair. I think this is okay.
Prisoners can be slaves. Okay.
Yes.
People that you conquer in battle.
Civilians, no, I'm not sure. Nowadays, is recognized as immoral and evil to
I'm
civilians.
not asking what it is. I'm asking back then what should they have done with the people? So they go to war with these nations that started war with them because they didn't pick the fights. They retaliated. They wipe out the soldiers. They wipe out the men because that's what you do in war. So what do you
Yes.
have left? You have the women and children left. What do you do with them?
You don't enslave them.
Again, what do you do with them? I'm not asking what you don't do with them. I'm asking you, what do you do with them?
Nothing.
So you send them out in the wilderness and die?
Will they? Okay, you're saying that they will die. They will have died without the men.
They would 100%. If they go out into the wilderness on their own, they'll die.
Well, okay, if that's what happens, then maybe you find a way. You find a way to integrate them in your community.
Okay, so you accept a
Or-
whole bunch. So for example, we take a whole bunch of people from another city and we say, okay, you're now part of our city. Just hang out with us. And they're all now living with a whole bunch of people that killed their husbands, their fathers, their uncles, their brothers. They just came. So they're all hanging out with these people that just slaughtered all their family,
Yeah,
just chilling. And you don't think that's going to be a problem?
if the problem is that people will get revenge, right, for what they did, then you can leave them into the wild. I mean,
Okay, then
so
they die.
Yeah, but that's how
Okay,
war is, you know.
so your solution is you rather kill them all than put them into indentured servitude.
Well, so they will die. Okay. Well, I can see your point in that if it's like that, then maybe you have a case. Okay, like if it was the only practical solution to this problem of the women and children being left to die without the men, and the only way to integrate them in society was to make them servants, slaves. If you think this is the only practical way to solve this, then maybe yes, you're right. Then in that
Okay,
case,
cool.
you're right. Okay.
All right. So now, last one. Somebody doesn't have enough money to live on the streets. They walk up to somebody and they say, "Hey, you give me room and board, and I will serve you. I'll clean your house. I'll do all the things that you want. I'll become your slave." Should they be allowed to do that?
Yes, but not that like you're doing this voluntary. And yes,
Mhm.
they should be allowed to do it. I think it's fine.
Okay. So then you have no issue with biblical slavery because that's how you became a slave in the Bible.
Okay.
Is either you were a prisoner of war, you were a criminal, or you sold yourself.
Okay. So you think, okay, if what you're saying is right, if the only way, I mean, that these women and children will not die was to become a slave, then maybe you have a good point about this.
Well, I don't know if it's the only way. I'm asking you, what's the other option?
Are they free to go to other nations to try and find like they can offer their services freely to Egypt, or they go to offer them to Assyria?
Guess what's going to happen to them if they go to Egypt?
They will be taken as slaves, you say? Okay. If this is 100% what is going to happen, then
Oh yeah, dude.
okay. Also, what if a small, okay, what about a small nation near, you know? Okay, I'm not sure this is exactly what is going to
I don't
happen.
know if there is any other nations that wouldn't have taken them or done horrible things. So like here's the thing. If you really want to get into what other nations were, like Israel is the most progressive nation out of the other nations. These
Okay.
other nations, they would take people, they would cut their eyes out and make them walk throughout the street where you stone them. Like that's
Okay.
what they would do in these other nations.
Okay.
Israel had no laws that allowed anything like that. You were not allowed to do that in Israel. So like if you had to pick a nation to be a slave in the ancient Near East, I'm not saying it's a good thing to do, but if you had to pick one, Israel is the one to pick, 150,000%.
Okay, but let me ask you this: are we sure that the women and children would have died without the men? I mean, is this
I don't
really
know. If they were sent out to the
because
wilderness,
I don't.
probably yes.
But why? Why not why sell them to the wilderness? Why don't leave them in the land they had before, in the city what they have, in their house?
Because they have no army, they have no one to protect them. Plus, there's also the rules of war, which is plunder. So all the things that were there had to be taken for Israel.
Yeah, I don't think you can take the house or
They'd still be left, right? And then you're also leaving a your combatant city that originally attacked you. And what are they going to do? If they have the chance to do so, they're going to take up arms and come back against you.
the women and children.
Well, the children are going to grow.
Yeah, then if that's what's going to happen, like for sure, then you have to kill. Okay, then yes. If you think that's what's going to happen, like very probable, then okay, then yes.
Right. So it doesn't seem like you're against the biblical slavery as you think you are. And you also have to remember every circumstance was treated differently based off who was ruling and how they handle it. They had governing bodies to basically look at things. You know, they probably weren't just murderous people walking around saying, look at that little child. I can't wait to make him my slave. Like, these weren't monstrous people.
Well, if what you are saying is that unless they take these children as slaves, the children will grow and attack them later, then yes.
Well, I don't know if they
But
will. I'm just saying it's possible. I'm saying there's so many things that we have to take into consideration.
Okay, I'm saying in that case, then yes, it will be okay. But I mean, I'm not sure if this is really the case. What if it's too little? It's just the amount of people left is just too little to attack them. It just to the point that it won't happen. It will not be reasonable for them to attack Israel.
Yeah, people do unreasonable things all the time, like freaking go over across seas during what do you call it? Like the jihadi people that were taking on U.S. Navy SEALs. Like they weren't winning, bro. Like, it was completely unreasonable to take on that fight. They were outnumbered, outgunned, everything. People do stuff like that all the time.
Yeah, one or two people, not 100% of the population. I mean, not a big percentage.
They don't have 100% of the population. You just wiped out most of them.
Yeah, but I mean, out of 100 people, maybe one or two will do something unreasonable. Not
no. So you're aware of like the terrorist groups that are over across seas, right?
Yes.
Yeah, these are not one or two people.
Compared to the total population of the country, I think yes, it's one of two people.
Right, not the whole city, right? But we're just talking these cities are wiped out. I'm just saying you don't know what a small group of people will do.
Sure, okay.
That's the only claim I'm making. I'm just saying there's a lot of factors you have to take into consideration. Like, it's very nice to just say, okay, everybody just live happy and let's hug and kiss and all be friends, but that's not the world we live in.
Oh, sure, okay. I can understand then your perspective if that's how things are, you know.
Okay. I appreciate the cordial conversation, man.
Me too, yeah, okay.
Yeah. All right, bro.
That's good.
Appreciate you. God bless.
Yeah, thank you for having me, okay.
No problem. Congratulations, you made it to the end of the video. If you want to watch more, you can click one of these and you can keep watching.